Hello, and welcome to GreyNoise University. I'm Brad Chiappetta, and this module is part of our GreyNoise API and CLI training series. This module will be covering the IP context endpoint and reviewing examples. The IP context endpoints are the primary API endpoints to use when you desire to get additional information from an IP address from the Internet Scanner dataset, which we commonly reference as our noise dataset. The IP context endpoints have two options and return all information from the noise dataset that is available for a queried IP address. The first one is a single IP lookup, and the second is a multiple IP lookup. When using the single IP lookup endpoint, the IP address is appended to the end of the API URL, which makes it easy to use. This endpoint uses a GET request. For usage monitoring, this endpoint consumes one search each time it is used. This endpoint will return a status code of 200, meaning the request was successful, a 400, meaning there was an error in the request, such as an invalid IP address being sent, a 401, meaning the API key provided was not valid, or a 429 if the daily rate limit was reached. For this endpoint, the only input required is the IP address that you wish to query. If we enter a sample and then click the Try It button, we can review the endpoint response. Let's run the same request in the CLI by copying the curl command from the API docs and passing it to our terminal. I'm also going to use a tool called JQ to help make the output easier to read. In the response, you can see that all of the metadata that is included on the IP details page in the GreyNoise visualizer is available. Now, let's go take a look at the bulk lookup endpoint. This endpoint is very similar to the data that was returned in the single IP lookup endpoint, but allows for up to 1,000 IP addresses to be looked up in a single API request. When using the multi or bulk IP lookup endpoints, a list of IP addresses are sent as part of the request body using the IPs key. This endpoint uses a POST request to send the request body information. For usage monitoring, this endpoint consumes one search for each IP address submitted in the request. For example, if 100 IP addresses are submitted in a single request, this will consume 100 searches for your daily allowance. Similar to the single IP lookup endpoint, this endpoint will respond with the same status codes as previously listed. Let's enter a set of IP addresses on the reference page. You can see that the CLI command samples how these IP addresses are then provided as a body parameter and sent to the API endpoint. Let's click the Try It button so that we can review the endpoint response. For this endpoint, you'll see the response returns a list of responses, one for each IP address submitted that is a valid routable IPv4 address. Any invalid IP addresses are removed from the response. Let's run this same request in the CLI again. In the response, you can see that all of the metadata that is included on the IP details page in the GreyNoise visualizer is available. You'll also see that our invalid IP addresses of 192.168.1.1 was removed, and that IP address 123.123.123.123 returned a seen false flag, meaning it is unidentified by the GreyNoise sensor network. This concludes this training module. If you have any questions on the topics covered, please reach out to support@greynoise.io.